Part 1. Andrew Jackson, 1835. The Save. Before the service existed, the United States Secret Service wasn't founded until 1865, and in one of history's more pointed ironies, the authorization was signed the same day Lincoln was shot, which means the agency designed to protect presidents came into existence the night the first one was killed. But the first documented save of a sitting American president happened 30 years before that founding, and the men who made it had no badges, no training, and no protocol. They just moved. January 30th, 1835. The East Portico of the U.S. Capitol. A funeral is underway and a crowd of several hundred people mills through the colonnade. A 35-year-old unemployed house painter named Richard Lawrence steps forward and raises a percussion pistol from a distance of roughly 8 feet. The cap fires. The powder doesn't. He raises his second pistol. He came prepared. And that one misfires too. Both weapons fail in sequence, against odds that investigators later calculated at roughly 1 in 125,000. In the absence of trained agents, what fills the gap is proximity and instinct. Several bystanders tackle Lawrence to the ground simultaneously, including, by documented account, future Tennessee Congressman Davy Crockett, a sentence that sounds like it belongs in a different kind of story and is completely verified. Lawrence is overpowered, arrested, and removed. The trial lasts 5 minutes. He's found not guilty by reason of insanity. The guns were tested afterward. Both fired perfectly. Nobody ever satisfactorily explained the double misfire. What the incident exposed was the structural gap at the center of American executive protection. A gap filled, on this particular afternoon, by probability and a crowd of willing strangers rather than by any institutional design. It took 3 more decades, 1 successful assassination, and the founding of the service itself for the country to start treating that gap as something a trained agency should close. Even then, it took more deaths before the agency understood how to actually do it. Part 2. Harry Truman, 1950. 38 seconds at Blair House. The most violent single episode in Secret Service operational history lasted 38 seconds. It happened on a public sidewalk in the middle of the afternoon, and it produced the only confirmed case of a Secret Service officer dying in direct defense of a sitting president. November 1st, 1950. Blair House, Pennsylvania Avenue, NW. The White House is undergoing renovation, so the protective detail has shifted the principal's residence across the street to the official guest quarters. The building is smaller, the perimeter tighter, the sightlines different from what the standard protocols are built around. The detail has adapted. What they haven't anticipated is a simultaneous 2-point approach. 2 Puerto Rican nationalists, 25-year-old Griselio Torresola and 36-year-old Oscar Collazo, close in from opposite ends of the block at the same time. Both armed, the approach timed to split the response. Collazo hits the front steps and opens fire on Private Donald Birdsell, who takes a round in the leg and returns fire from the pavement. Torresola, the more experienced shooter, works the west side of the building and puts down 2 more officers in rapid succession before reaching the guard booth. Private Leslie Koffolt is in that booth. Torresola shoots him once in the chest at close range and keeps moving toward the building's entrance. The outer perimeter is effectively gone. Torresola is seconds from the door. What happens next is the moment the service still studies. Koffolt, already mortally wounded, already bleeding out into his uniform, braces himself against the booth, raises his service weapon, and fires a single round that travels 30 feet and strikes Torresola in the head. Torresola dies before he hits the ground. Koffolt dies 4 hours later on the operating table. He never regained consciousness. The second save is quieter and gets almost no attention in any account of that day. Upstairs, an agent hears the gunfire and physically pulls the principal away from the window he'd moved to look out of. No confrontation, no weapon, just a set of hands and a body moving between a person and a line of sight. It doesn't generate footage or a report that makes the papers. It just happens, because that's what the training produces. The 38-second battle left 1 agent dead and 3 officers wounded. Collazo was convicted and sentenced to death, a sentence later commuted to life. The tactical analysis of the Blair House attack is still included in Secret Service training curriculum. The lesson it demonstrates isn't complicated. A split approach against a fixed perimeter can overwhelm a detail faster than a response can organize. And the last line of defense is a single individual making a single decision in a single second. Koffolt made that decision. It cost him everything. Part 3. Gerald Ford, 1975. Twice. In 17 days. The protective detail's job is to anticipate threats. What happened in California in September 1975 wasn't something the advance teams had modeled. because the standard threat assessment frameworks of the era weren't built to account for two unconnected individuals in two separate cities, moving on the same principle within 17 days of each other. The detail handled both. They shouldn't have needed to handle either. September 5th, 1975, Sacramento, Capitol Park. The advanced sweep has cleared the route and the rope line is set. Special Agent Larry Bjendorf is working the crowd side, the position that faces outward, watches hands, watches eyes, reads the body language of people pressing toward the rope. A 26-year-old Manson family associate named Lynette Squeaky Fromm is in the crowd wearing a red robe, and she raises a .45 caliber pistol toward the principal from arm's length. Bjendorf moves on the weapon, not on her face, not on her clothing, on the weapon, and gets his hand around the slide before she can fire. He drives her arm down, controls the gun, and calls it in while keeping her pinned. The gun has 4 rounds in the magazine and nothing in the chamber, a fact Bjendorf doesn't know and doesn't have time to check. He sees a weapon raised at a principal, and he neutralizes the weapon. The rest is paperwork. Fromm is arrested, convicted of attempted assassination, sentenced to life. 17 days later, September 22nd, San Francisco, Post Street, outside the Street, Francis Hotel. The motorcade is positioned. The principal exits the building and moves toward the vehicle. Sarah Jane Moore is standing in a crowd on the opposite side of the street with a .38 caliber revolver, and she fires once. The shot misses, deflected slightly because a nearby bystander grabbed at her arm in the same moment she pulled the trigger. And the detail immediately collapses around the principal, shields him against the vehicle, and has him inside and moving in under 3 seconds. Moore fires again as the motorcade accelerates. The round hits a wall. She's tackled, arrested, convicted, sentenced to life. 2 incidents, 2 cities, 17 days. 2 different agents made 2 different saves under 2 different threat conditions, neither of which the advance work had flagged as elevated. The after-action analysis produced changes to how the service ran outdoor crowd exposures in California. Tighter perimeters, shorter rope lines, more agents working the crowd side rather than the interior. The lesson was filed and implemented. The detail that learned it in Sacramento had to apply it again before the month was out. Part 4. Ronald Reagan, 1981. Jerry Parr's decision. We covered the Hinckley shooting in the opening, but the full architecture of what Agent Jerry Parr did that day, and why it worked, is worth understanding in more detail, because it's the case that professional protectors cite most often when they talk about what the job actually requires beyond the physical training. The physical part is Agent Tim McCarthy. When the shots start, McCarthy's body executes a trained response before conscious thought catches up. Turn toward the threat, expand the profile, cover the principal. He takes the round meant for someone else and goes down. That part of the response is muscle memory. 6 months of training compressed into a fraction of a second. Parr's save is different. It requires judgment in conditions where judgment is almost impossible. He has a principal who's been pushed into a vehicle under fire, who's complaining of chest pain, whose color is still acceptable, who walks and talks. The standard protocol says the White House, with its dedicated medical unit, its known layout, its controlled environment, is the destination for a wounded principal. Parr overrides the protocol. He reads something in the breathing, something in the pallor starting to come in at the edges, that tells him the 4-minute drive to GWU Hospital is the decision that matters. He makes it without consultation, without committee, in a moving car with sirens going. He was right by approximately 90 seconds, according to the surgical team that operated that afternoon. If the motorcade had gone to the White House, the principal would have died in transit. Parr later described the thing that triggered his call, a film he'd seen as a child, depicting a Civil War soldier with a chest wound and the specific sound of the breathing. The principal's breathing reminded him of it, and that memory, from a film seen decades before he entered the service, is what informed a decision that changed the outcome. No manual builds for that. The training creates the conditions in which that kind of recognition can operate. The rest is the individual. McCarthy recovered fully. He later served as police chief of Orland Park, Illinois, and said in interviews that he doesn't remember making a decision to step in front of the shot. His body was already moving. That's the point of the training. Part 5. Bill Clinton, 1994. The night. The fence wasn't enough. The standard assumption about the White House perimeter is that the building is a hard target, that the combination of fencing, surveillance, rooftop positions, and uniformed presence creates a threshold too costly for most threats to cross. What the fall of 1994 demonstrated was that the threshold had significant gaps, and that multiple different actors could find those gaps independently within the space of a few weeks. September 12, 1994. A Cessna 150 crosses into restricted airspace after midnight, descends across the mall, clips a tree on the south lawn, and impacts the base of the building below the map room. The pilot dies on impact. No explosives. Limited structural damage. The air defense protocols that should have intercepted the aircraft, which existed on paper, failed to activate in time. An investigation into why produced classified findings that have never been fully released. The perimeter in the air had a gap the size of a small plane, and nobody had closed it. 2 months later, on October 29th, Francisco Duran positions himself on the Pennsylvania Avenue sidewalk and fires 29 rounds from a semi-automatic rifle at the building's facade in under 5 seconds. Uniformed division officers respond, tackle him while he's reloading, and take him into custody without any additional injuries. Agents inside push occupants away from exterior-facing windows and move them to interior positions. The response works. The gap that allowed Duran to stand on a public sidewalk with a semi-automatic rifle for 5 seconds before being stopped is addressed the following year when the service successfully argues for the permanent closure of Pennsylvania Avenue to vehicle traffic, a change that remains in effect today and that every tourist walking past the North Lawn sees without knowing what produced it. The visible security infrastructure surrounding the White House, the barriers, the fencing profiles, the standoff distances, is almost entirely a product of failures. Each modification traces back to a specific incident that exposed a specific gap. The agents who pushed through those changes after 1994 were building a perimeter around lessons learned in real time, often after something had already gone wrong. Part 6. George W. Bush, 2005. The Grenade That Didn't Go Off. May 10, 2005. Freedom Square, Tbilisi, Georgia. The Secret Service advance team has swept the square, coordinated with Georgian security services, established the rope lines and the stage perimeter, and positioned agents throughout a crowd of roughly 40,000 people. It's a foreign visit, which means working alongside a host nation's protective apparatus, which means relying on systems and personnel the service hasn't trained with and can't fully evaluate. That's the baseline vulnerability on every international trip. 27-year-old Vladimir Arutyunian is in the crowd with a live Soviet-era RGD-5 hand grenade. He wraps it in a red handkerchief, a field modification designed to slow the safety lever and give him more time to throw, and launches it toward the stage from within the crowd. The grenade lands approximately 65 feet from the podium. It sits on the ground. It doesn't explode. The handkerchief held the lever in place on impact, and the fuse fails to activate. The Secret Service detail doesn't detect the throw. The grenade sits on the ground, live, armed, functional, as investigators confirmed later. While the principal finishes his remarks, shakes hands, and is walked off the stage and into the motorcade by agents who don't yet know what just landed 65 feet away. A Georgian security officer spots the device, identifies it, and quietly signals to his supervisor without triggering a crowd event. The motorcade moves. The alert goes out after the principal is clear. Arutyunian is identified from surveillance footage and arrested 2 months later. The post-incident analysis produced specific changes to how the service coordinates with foreign protective services on crowd screening. The gap that Arutyunian walked through, a live grenade in his jacket, in a swept crowd, was a gap in the coordination layer between American agents and Georgian counterparts. The Tbilisi case is the most recent confirmed instance of an actual deployed weapon being thrown at a sitting principal. The save was not the service's execution. The save was a handkerchief and a failed fuse. That matters. It means the gap was real, the threat made it through, and the outcome depended on a mechanical failure rather than a protective action. The after-action didn't pretend otherwise. Part 7. Barack Obama. The Constant Threat. In 2014, the service publicly confirmed that the threat volume directed at the principal during this period ran at approximately 4 times the historic average. The agency declined to define the historic average, which means the public is working with a ratio and no denominator. But the operational reality inside the protective division was not abstract. The caseload was larger, the screening demands were heavier, and the incidents that broke through the screening layer were more frequent than in any prior comparable period. The 2011 White House shooting illustrates the screening problem directly. Oscar Ortega Hernandez fires multiple rounds at the building from Constitution Avenue. 2 bullets strike the exterior. 1 lodges in a window frame on the upper residence level. 1 is found on the roof. The uniformed response at the perimeter classifies the sounds as a car backfire and stands down. A housekeeper finds broken glass the following morning and reports it. The service takes 4 days to confirm that the building was struck by gunfire. Ortega Hernandez is in Pennsylvania before the investigation correctly identifies what happened on the street outside. The 4-day gap between impact and confirmation is a classification failure, not a response failure. The perimeter held, the exterior absorbed the rounds, nobody inside was exposed. But the failure to correctly identify an active shooting at the White House for 96 hours represents a breakdown in the intelligence layer that is supposed to sit above the physical response layer. The investigation that followed produced changes to how the service processes exterior impact reports, particularly at night and on weekends when the uniformed presence at the perimeter runs lighter. The 2014 fence breach by Omar Gonzalez is the harder case. Gonzalez scales the fence, crosses the north lawn, enters through the north portico door, which is unlocked, an alarm near the entrance having been silenced at the request of the building's residential staff who found it inconvenient, and makes it through the entrance hall and into the east room before agents tackle him. He's carrying a folding knife. The door was unlocked. The alarm was off. The response was slower than it should have been because the first agent to engage him in the entrance hall is overpowered and the backup takes seconds to arrive that feel much longer. Director Julia Pearson resigns within weeks. The congressional hearing that follows is candid in a way that congressional hearings rarely are. The gaps in the Blair House perimeter were operational, the gaps in 1994 were structural, but the gaps in 2014 were procedural. The door should not have been unlocked, the alarm should not have been silenced, and the fact that it had been arranged that way for the comfort of residential staff represents an organizational culture that had allowed convenience to quietly erode security over time. The principal wasn't in the building. The building was still breached. The reform that followed was institutional, not just procedural. The saves that never made the news. Every case in this video made the public record because it couldn't be contained. It involved a weapon, a body, a trial, a congressional investigation, something that left a documented trail. These are the edge cases of presidential protection, the moments when the layered system failed all the way down to the last line and an agent had to make a decision in real time with no margin for error. The service makes somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 arrests annually across its full mandate. A significant share of those arrests involve threat cases. The individual who posts specific intent on a public platform, the person whose letter to the White House triggers a field investigation, the man flagged at an advanced screening 6 weeks before an event who's quietly interviewed in a parking lot and assessed as requiring continued monitoring. None of that generates a press release. None of it appears in a public record unless it eventually produces a charge. Former agents who've written about the work are consistent on one point. The vast majority of what the Protective Division actually does is intelligence work, advance work, and quiet intervention at the front end of the threat timeline, long before a weapon appears. The advance agent who walks every route 3 days before the principal arrives, mapping sightlines and identifying elevated positions, and marking the buildings that need roof access restricted. The intelligence analyst who correlates threat communications across databases and flags a name for field follow-up. The uniformed officer who notices someone at a rope line whose behavior pattern doesn't fit the crowd and calls it in before the principal exits the vehicle. Most of the work is invisible precisely because it works. The cases we've covered, McCarthy absorbing the round, Koffelt's final shot, Parr redirecting the motorcade, Buendorf's hand on Fromm's gun, are what happens when the front end of the system doesn't catch it and the last line has to hold. They are extraordinary moments. They are also, in the operational philosophy of the service, failures, evidence that something earlier in the chain didn't work the way it was supposed to. The agents who make the visible saves are not the plan, they're the contingency.